In the late autumn of the year 840, a profound quietude descended upon the high rocky plateaus of Eastern Francia, a region where the earth lifted itself toward the sky in massive terraced shelves of ancient grey limestone. Here, far above the fertile river valleys where the rivers wound like silver ribbons through the lowlands, the landscape was defined by its stark, enduring geometry. The ground was a mosaic of weathered stone and thin, dark soil held together by the deep roots of ancestral oaks and tough, wind-bent shrubs. As the sun dipped lower toward the western horizon, its light no longer carried the golden warmth of summer, but instead cast long, pale amber shadows that stretched across the undulating fields. Every rock, every small crevice in the craggy hillsides seemed to catch the final fading illumination of the day, reflecting a soft, muted glow that spoke of immense time and unyielding permanence. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of high altitudes and distant forests, a clarity that made the faraway peaks appear near and finely etched against the cooling sky. In this elevated borderland, a small agricultural settlement sat nestled against the protective curve of a limestone ridge. The village was a cluster of modest timber longhouses, their steep thatched roofs darkened by seasons of rain and weathered by the relentless mountain winds. Around these dwellings, simple fences woven from flexible hazel branches marked the boundaries of small garden plots and communal pens, where the earth had been worked by generations of patient hands. Now, as the twilight began to gather, the village seemed to merge completely with the surrounding stone, its brown timbers and grey thatch mirroring the natural palette of the plateau. From the small square openings in the roofs, thin, delicate plumes of pale blue wood smoke rose straight into the breathless air, drifting lazily upward before dissolving into the vast, darkening canopy above. It was a scene of absolute stillness, where the only movement was the slow, rhythmic curling of the smoke and the gradual elongation of the shadows across the dusty lanes. Beneath the surface of this quiet village lay a hidden world of immense depth and complexity. The topsoil, though dark and rich in the hollows, was only a thin mantle over a vast subterranean fortress of thick limestone strata. These massive layers of stone, deposited over countless millennia, formed a dense, impermeable barrier that locked away the secrets of the deeper earth. For generations, the people of the plateau had known that far beneath these heavy, silent shelves of rock, a subterranean river system existed, fed by the rains and snows of the higher peaks. This water, pure and incredibly cold, travelled through unseen fissures and dark, limestone caverns, flowing silently in the deep shadows, completely isolated from the sunlit world above. To reach it was a task of monumental proportions, requiring an intimate knowledge of the stone and an enduring patience that mirrored the slow turning of the seasons. The villagers lived in harmony with this hidden reality, relying on the shallow surface streams that trickled down from the higher crags during the warmer months, while knowing that the true, eternal lifeblood of the land remained safely cradled in the deep, stony heart of the plateau. As the final remnants of daylight receded, the sky transitioned through a magnificent spectrum of pale violet, deep plum, and finally a rich velvety indigo. The first stars began to appear, tiny brilliant points of silver light that pierced the clean mountain atmosphere with a cold, steady clarity. The north wind, which had been a mere whisper during the afternoon, began to stir more noticeably, sweeping across the open plateaus with a low, mournful sigh that rustled the dry leaves of the oaks and whistled softly through the eaves of the timber houses. This wind carried with it a new, unmistakable quality, a deep, biting cold that seemed to originate from the northernmost reaches of the world, promising a winter of unusual intensity and duration. It was a cold that did not merely sit upon the skin, but seemed to sink into the very stones themselves, drawing out the last lingering warmth of the autumn sun and sealing the earth in a crisp, crystalline embrace. Within the longhouses, the heavy wooden doors were barred against the encroaching chill, and the small hearth fires were tended with care, their gentle, amber glow flickering against the hand-hewn beams and casting warm, dancing shadows across the simple earthen floors. The village slept, suspended in the quiet interval between the fading of the old season and the majestic, unyielding arrival of the frost. The winter of 840 did not arrive with a sudden dramatic storm, but rather with a creeping, systematic stillness that began at the very edges of the high plateau, the small, winding creeks that had long provided the village with its daily water, streams that traditionally ran clear and musical over beds of smoothly rounded pebbles, began to alter their character under the steady nocturnal drop in temperature. At first, the change was nearly invisible to the casual observer who walked the paths at dawn. Along the muddy banks where the reeds grew dry and brittle, tiny needles of ice began to form during the deepest hours of the night. These delicate glassy shards reached out from the shoreline like fragile fingers, interlocking with one another to create a thin, transparent lattice that mirrored the cold stars above. With each passing hour, this lattice grew denser and more resilient, creeping steadily toward the center of the current, where the water still moved, though with a noticeable heavy sluggishness. The liquid seemed to thicken, losing its bright splashing vitality and taking on a dense leaden appearance that reflected the pale overcast sky of the late autumn days. As the days progressed, the cold deepened into something far more absolute, a quiet force that seemed to slow the very passage of time. The murmuring sound of the water, which had been a constant background melody for the village since the spring thaw, began to fade into an eerie, profound silence. It was as if the landscape were losing its voice, one stream at a time, as the frost asserted its dominion over the high country. The larger pools, where the current paused before tumbling down the limestone shelves, froze from the top down, creating thick, solid plates of milky white ice that obscured the dark depths below. Beneath these heavy panes, one could initially see the faint, ghostly movement of trapped air bubbles, shifting slowly like silver spirits as the remaining water struggled to find a path forward. But soon even this subterranean movement ceased entirely. The ice thickened by inches each night, pressing downward into the rocky stream beds until the water was entirely immobilized, locked in a tight, unyielding grip that transformed the fluid veins of the earth into static, pale highways of crystalline stone. The surrounding landscape underwent a parallel transformation, losing all semblance of fluidity and motion under the grey winter sky. The wet mosses that clung to the limestone boulders, usually vibrant and damp to the touch, became brittle and encrusted with a heavy rime of white frost that sparkled like crushed sugar in the rare moments of sunlight. Every blade of dead grass in the surrounding meadows was meticulously coated in a delicate layer of ice crystals, turning the expansive fields into vast, shimmering sheets that crunched softly under the slightest weight. The small springs that seeped directly from the hillsides, creating miniature waterfalls that usually misted the cold air, were frozen mid-cascade. They hung from the grey stone cliffs like massive architectural pillars of solid glass, capturing and distorting the weak winter light in brilliant facets of blue and silver. These frozen sculptures stood as silent sentinels of the frost, a testament to the sheer arresting power of the cold that had settled over the entire region, turning what was once a landscape of movement into a still museum of ice. For the villagers, the freezing of the surface waters was an ominous sign of the trials that lay ahead in this forgotten corner of the world. The paths down to the traditional dipping pools became treacherous and slick, coated in a layer of smooth black ice that made every step an exercise in deliberate balance and quiet concentration. The wooden buckets left outside near the doorways for even a short duration would crack as the residual moisture within their staves expanded into solid ice, rendering them useless for the daily chores. When the workers went down to the banks with heavy iron rods to break through the surface crust, they found that each morning the task required far more effort than the day before. The holes they vigorously chopped into the ice would not merely be skinned over by a thin film. They would be completely sealed by a layer of ice several inches thick, requiring sustained, exhausting labor just to reach a few precious cups of freezing, silty liquid that lay trapped beneath. The realization began to settle over the community that the surface world was closing its gates, locking away its resources behind an impenetrable barrier of frost, and leaving the village to contemplate the immense, silent void that now wrapped itself around their high stony home. The frost did not limit its dominion to the running waters. It began a slow, silent conquest of the earth itself, seeping downward through the layers of dead leaves, the withered winter grass, and into the dark, fertile topsoil that had sustained the village for generations. This process was quiet, entirely invisible to the casual eye, yet monumental in its structural finality. The moisture trapped within the organic matrix of the loam began to expand, forming microscopic needles of crystal ice that bound the loose particles of dust, sand, and clay together into a single, cohesive block. Within a few days, the fields that had once been soft and pliable under the wooden ploughshares became entirely unyielding. The rich earth, which in autumn had smelled of damp decay and sweet harvest, was stripped of its seasonal softness, taking on a pale greyish hue as the frost drew all flexibility from its veins. To step upon the land was no longer to press into a responsive, living cushion of moss and soil, but to tread upon a surface as hard and unforgiving as cast iron. The footsteps of the villagers echoed with a strange, dull resonance across the open landscape, a metallic ring that highlighted the profound transformation of the highland topography under the weight of the deep freeze. The village watched this atmospheric hardening with a quiet, contemplative anxiety that seemed to match the absolute stillness of the weather. The sky above the plateau hung low and oppressive, a vast expanse of heavy, unmoving clouds that resembled a blanket of coarse, unwashed wool, tinted with shades of slate and charcoal. There was no wind to stir these clouds, nor any break in the grey canopy to allow the weak winter sun to warm the freezing settlement. The light that did filter through was uniform and flat, casting no distinct shadows and draining the landscape of its natural colours, leaving only a monochromatic world of white rime, dark timber, and ancient grey stone. The birds that usually frequented the hedgerows had long since departed for the lower valleys, leaving only the occasional solitary crow to circle silently above the frozen fields, its distant, raspy call emphasizing the immense solitude of the high plateau. The atmosphere carried a heavy, solid weight, a pressure that felt as though the sky itself were gradually lowering onto the timber roofs of the longhouses, sealing the community inside a timeless capsule of absolute frost where time itself seemed to have frozen in place. As the permafrost pushed deeper into the subterranean layers, reaching down into the roots of the sleeping crops and the foundations of the stone walls, the physical reality of their isolation became starkly apparent to the craftsmen and labourers of the village. Simple tasks that had once been a routine part of daily life were now met with an insurmountable resistance from the natural elements. When the farmers attempted to dig small storage pits into the ground to protect their remaining turnips and cabbages from freezing, their iron spades struck the earth with a sharp, jarring vibration that rattled the bones of their arms and shoulders. The metal edges, forged with care in the village smithy, did not slice through the soil but instead blunted, chipped, or shattered upon impact, leaving only small white scars on the dark, icy crust of the earth. The ground had become a fortress, a solid shield of frozen clay and gravel that refused to open for the needs of the living, defying the strength of both man and beast under the darkening winter sky. The twilight hours brought an even deeper sense of enclosure, as the pale grey of the day dissolved into the heavy velvet blackness of the northern night. The cold became so intense that the heavy wooden timbers of the longhouses would occasionally groan and crack in the dark, a sharp, sudden sound like a snapping branch that startled the livestock in their stalls and echoed through the quiet rooms. The villagers gathered closely around their central hearths, watching the slow consumption of the oak logs, the orange embers casting long, flickering shadows against the wattle and daub walls. Outside, the world was completely locked in place, a silent expanse of iron earth and frozen air where nothing moved and nothing changed, presenting a landscape of pure endurance. The channel is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of relaxation and peaceful sleep. The biting wind that arose from the northernmost reaches of the continent became the true architect of the highland winter, reshaping the atmosphere of the entire plateau with its persistent, icy current. It was a wind born in the vast unmapped expanses of the northern forests, travelling over frozen plains and dark rivers before ascending the jagged limestone cliffs that guarded the borders of the village. As it swept across the open, elevated terrain, it carried no moisture for soft snowfall, but rather a dry, piercing cold that seemed to compress the very air into a dense, crystalline medium. The cliffs themselves, massive walls of pale grey stone that had stood for eons as the silent foundations of the region, became the primary stage for this atmospheric display. The wind buffeted the ancient stone buttresses, whistling low and deep through the narrow fissures and rock cutouts, creating a continuous resonant hum that vibrated through the bedrock itself. This sound was not one of sudden fury, but a steady, unyielding cadence, a monolithic drone that filled the wide open spaces and signaled the complete lock of the season over the high country. Under the influence of this relentless highland breath, the entire world was progressively reduced to a stark, beautiful canvas of white and grey. The sky above hung like a vast, seamless dome of polished slate, completely devoid of the blue gradients of autumn or the soft golds of summer. The clouds were heavy and uniform, moving with an almost imperceptible slowness that made the heavens appear as solid and static as the ground below. On the earth, the landscape lost all its varied textures, swallowed by a uniform coat of fine, powdery frost that the wind continuously shifted and sculpted across the barren landscape. This frost accumulated in the lee of every boulder, filling the shallow depressions and smoothing out the rugged contours of the limestone terrain until the plateau resembled a frozen sea of pale silver and ash. The few ancient oaks that survived on the ridge stood as dark, solitary statues, their gnarled branches meticulously coated in a thick crystalline rime that grew horizontally against the wind, forming delicate, brittle combs of ice that caught the flat, pale light of the winter days. The village itself was completely enveloped by this monochrome universe, its presence marked only by the dark lines of its timber frames against the white expanse. The wind tested every structure, sweeping over the steep slopes of the thatched roofs and sliding down the outer walls of wattle and mud. The heavy rye straw of the thatch, packed thick and secured by long hazel poles, groaned softly under the constant pressure, its dry fibres rustling with a faint, papery whisper that could be heard within the dim interiors. Tiny, sharp particles of ice, carried from the high crags by the gale, scratched continuously against the wooden shutters and barred doors, a soft and rhythmic scraping that sounded like the gentle turning of ancient parchment pages. Yet, despite the restless movement of the air outside, a profound sense of enclosure and safety remained within the sturdy dwellings, where the thick timber walls acted as a definitive barrier between the moving cold of the atmosphere and the absolute still of the domestic hearths. This persistent wind eventually succeeded in sealing the village away from the rest of the world, creating an environment of absolute isolation on the high plateau. Looking out from the limestone ridge, the lower valleys and distant river basins were entirely swallowed by a dense, freezing mist that pooled in the lowlands like a white, unmoving ocean. The village felt like an island suspended in a vast, silent void of grey clouds and frozen air, completely detached from the geography of the lower world. Every path that led down from the heights was covered by shifting drifts of fine rime, making the boundaries of the settlement invisible and untraceable. The air itself became so cold that it seemed to slow the transmission of light, leaving the landscape wrapped in a permanent, soft twilight where the boundaries between earth and sky blurred into a single peaceful gradient of silver, shadow and stone, preserving the high village in a state of timeless, undisturbed rest. Within the long, shadowed interiors of the village longhouses, where families lived in close proximity to their domestic beasts according to the ancient customs of the Carolingian frontier, a subtle and sobering shift began to manifest. These structures, built with heavy oak posts and walls lined with a thick mixture of clay and straw, were designed to capture and hold every fragment of warmth generated by the central hearth fire. In the rear section of the building, separated from the human quarters only by a low timber partition, the cattle, sheep and oxen stood tightly packed in their wooden stalls. The air here was thick with the scent of dry mountain hay, old straw and the warm, heavy musk of the animals. In ordinary winters, this barn section was a sanctuary of gentle activity, filled with the sound of rhythmic chewing and the soft, content shuffling of hooves in the deep bedding. But as the permafrost locked the landscape tighter in its icy grip, an unusual stillness settled over the pens. The animals stood quietly, their heads lowered toward the empty manger troughs, their large, dark eyes reflecting the faint amber glow of the distant hearth fire with a look of silent, patient endurance. The breath of the livestock rose into the cold air of the rafters in thick white plumes, condensing almost immediately upon the frozen timber beams above. Over days of unyielding freeze, this moisture had transformed the underside of the thatch into a glittering canopy of delicate rime and tiny ice crystals that caught the stray glints of light like a ceiling of frosted glass. The cattle, normally robust and resilient against the mountain cold, began to exhibit a deep, systemic fatigue that had nothing to do with a lack of forage. Their thick winter coats, coarse and insulated, were dusted with white frost from their own respiration, and their movements became remarkably slow, deliberate, and sparse. The sheep huddled closer together, a dense sea of heavy wool that shifted only slightly when the cold wind whistled through the microscopic gaps in the mud-plastered walls. The primary challenge facing these creatures was not the cold itself, which their bodies were well equipped to withstand, but the complete disappearance of liquid moisture. The water tubs, carved from solid logs of ash and elm, were no longer reservoirs of life, but held only thick, unyielding blocks of solid ice that reached down to the dark wood of the bottom. The caretakers of the village, moving quietly among the stalls with small lard lamps that cast flickering, smoky shadows across the timber uprights, observed these signs with a deepening, unspoken concern. They touched the dry, warm noses of the oxen and ran their calloused hands along the rough flanks of the dairy cows, feeling the slow, heavy thrumming of their hearts. The lack of water was beginning to cast a long, invisible shadow over the entire community, transforming a severe winter into an existential crisis of survival. Every morning, the task of melting ice over the domestic hearths yielded only enough water for the immediate needs of the families, a meagre ration that left nothing to spare for the large, thirsty tongues of the livestock. To watch the great working beasts, the oxen that had broken the heavy plateau soil in the spring and hauled the massive timber logs from the forests, grow increasingly lethargic, was to look directly into the fragile future of the village itself. Without these animals, the fields would remain unploughed when the spring finally arrived, and the entire cyclical rhythm of highland life would be broken. This quiet predicament did not breed panic, but rather a profound meditative gathering of collective resolve within the timber walls. The elders and the heads of households sat long into the night, their eyes fixed on the dying embers of the central fire, listening to the soft, occasional lowing of a thirsty cow in the darkness, a sound that was low, mournful, and heavy with a timeless plea. The surface of the earth had closed its hands, and the shallow streams were dead, frozen to the bedrock. The village was suspended on a high shelf of limestone, caught between a frozen sky and a locked earth, with its most valuable companions slowly fading in the dark pens. It became absolutely clear to every soul in the settlement that they could no longer rely on the superficial layers of the world to sustain them. If they were to survive until the thaw, they would have to find a way to reach deep into the absolute core of the plateau, past the iron earth and the heavy stone, to awaken the ancient waters that slept in the dark below. On a night when the cold outside seemed to achieve a quiet crystalline absolute, the elders and the master builders of the village gathered within the largest timber longhouse to hold council. This structure, which had served as the focal point of the community for generations, was built from massive blackened oak trunks that had been felled when the Carolingian Empire was still young. The air inside was heavy with the rich aromatic scent of seasoned pine resin, ancient dried peat, and the slow, steady accumulation of wood smoke that hung in a permanent, pale layer just beneath the high thatched rafters. In the center of the long room, a great rectangular hearth lined with thick blocks of river granite held a deep bed of glowing orange coals. The fire was kept low and deliberate, casting a warm, amber illumination that flickered softly across the weathered faces of the men and women who sat on low benches of split ash. There was no haste in their movements. They moved with the slow, dignified gravity of people who spent their lives in close communion with the cyclical rhythms of the seasons and the unyielding realities of the soil. Among those gathered were the oldest members of the community, individuals whose memories stretched back through decades of alpine winters, and the master builders who understood the hidden geometry of timber and stone. Their hands, resting on their knees or wrapped around simple wooden bowls of warm broth, were deeply lined and calloused, scarred by years of labor with the axe, the plough, and the forge. As they sat in the quiet warmth, the silence between them was long and meditative, punctuated only by the soft rhythmic crackle of a drying log or the low, distant moan of the north wind passing over the roof thatch. They were observing the behavior of the fire and the quality of the ash, drawing upon a deep reservoir of traditional lore that had been passed down from mouth to ear through generations of frontier life. This was a knowledge born of necessity, preserved not in written manuscripts or vellum scrolls, but in the living memory of the collective, waiting to be called upon when the superficial resources of the world failed. The conversation, when it finally began, was low and measured, each voice carrying a calm, deliberate weight that matched the stillness of the room. An old builder whose lineage had worked the stone quarries since the days when Roman legions still patrolled the distant river borders began to speak of the ancient art of fire setting. He described how the great builders of antiquity had not merely fought against the bedrock with iron and muscle, but had instead used the element of heat to master the stubborn limestone. He spoke of how intense concentrated fire, when applied systematically to the surface of a cold rock shelf, could expand the mineral matrix from within, creating invisible tensions that would eventually cause the stone to fracture and split with a sharp, distinct report. This was a technique of patience, requiring a precise understanding of the stone's grain, the duration of the burn, and the specific behavior of different types of wood fuel. To force a path through the deep plateau, they would have to treat the earth not as an enemy to be conquered quickly, but as a dense, sleeping giant that could be coaxed open through the ancient chemistry of flame and iron. The elders listened with a quiet, unblinking focus, their eyes reflecting the steady, rhythmic pulsing of the hearth embers. They analyzed the remaining stores of hardwood, calculating how many cords of dry oak and ash could be spared from the domestic fires to fuel the deep excavation. Every piece of wood would have to be accounted for, balanced between the immediate survival of the families and the long-term salvation of the well. The strategy that emerged from this quiet council was one of continuous alternating rhythm, a perpetual cycle of fire and steel that would require the cooperative labor of the entire village, operating in shifts through the dark winter days and nights. There would be no room for individual haste or erratic effort. The work would have to proceed with the steady, unyielding precision of a heartbeat. As the council drew to a close, an absolute sense of purpose settled over the room, replacing the vague shadow of anxiety with a clear, structured path forward into the frozen deep. All stories presented on this channel are global historical tales, gently curated and narrated based on themes such as the rise and fall of nations, human cultures, and extraordinary journeys through time. To understand the immense scale of the task that lay before the small settlement, one had to look past the timber sills of the houses and look down into the vertical architecture of the plateau's underworld. Directly beneath the frozen crust of the topsoil lay the upper tier of the bedrock, a fractured and heavily weathered limestone known to the local builders as the grey crust. This initial layer was a chaotic arrangement of stone blocks, split and dislodged over thousands of years by the persistent fingers of frost and the deep roots of ancestral trees. It was a porous, unreliable stratum, filled with narrow earth pockets and small pockets of air where the winter cold had already penetrated, turning the moisture within the rock into delicate, internal networks of frost. Here the stone was brittle but stubborn, its fractures filled with frozen clay that acted like a natural mortar, binding the loose blocks into a deceptive, solid mass that resisted the simple intrusion of iron wedges and wooden levers. Beneath this weathered crust, however, the true nature of the plateau revealed itself in a series of massive, uninterrupted sedimentary shelves that had remained undisturbed since the dawn of creation. These deeper layers were composed of an extraordinarily dense, fine-grained limestone, a stone that had been born millions of years prior at the bottom of a vast primordial ocean. Here, the compressed remnants of countless generations of ancient marine life, microscopic shells, calcified corals, and mineral-rich silt had been pressed together under the weight of vanished seas, transforming over unimaginable stretches of time into a monolithic fortress of solid rock. This stone was not uniform in color. It shifted slowly from a pale, ghostly cream near the top to a deep, solemn charcoal in the lower depths, its face marbled by thin, winding veins of white calcite that glittered like frozen lightning in the absolute darkness of the subterranean world. In these profound depths, far below the reach of the winter winds and the changing of the seasons, the earth existed in a state of perpetual heavy equilibrium. There was no sound here, no movement, and no light. It was a kingdom of absolute silence where the passage of centuries left no mark upon the stone. While the surface world above was buffeted by the icy north wind and wrapped in a monochrome shroud of frost, these deep limestone shelves maintained a constant, chilly temperature that never varied by a single degree. The air within the occasional hidden fissure was thick, still, and heavy with the clean, metallic scent of cold minerals and ancient dust. It was a world entirely self-contained, a massive geological shield that stood as a protective barrier between the active, fragile life of the sunlit plateau and the mysterious currents that moved through the absolute core of the earth. At the very base of this monumental stone staircase, hundreds of feet below the village lanes, lay the ultimate objective of the excavation, the great subterranean aquifers of the high country. Here, the dense limestone shelves finally gave way to a complex network of broader fissures and dark, echoing caverns that had been slowly carved out by the silent passage of water over eons of geological time. In these hidden spaces, the moisture that fell upon the distant mountains was gathered and filtered, trickling slowly through miles of pristine stone until it collected in deep, motionless pools of absolute clarity. This water was completely isolated from the impurities and hazards of the upper world, a pure and eternal lifeblood that held the very survival of the plateau within its dark, quiet reservoirs. It was a treasure locked behind 1,000 stone doors, waiting in the deep stillness for the rhythmic sound of iron and the warmth of flame to break its ancient slumber and call it forth to the surface. The settlement itself stood as a testament to the quiet resilience of early medieval craftsmanship, an arrangement of timber and earth designed specifically to withstand the long, unyielding sieges of the Highland winter. Each longhouse was oriented with its narrowest, sturdiest end facing directly into the prevailing northern gales, allowing the bitter winds to slide harmlessly over the low, sloping eaves rather than buffeting the broader side walls. The roofs were massive architectural achievements in themselves, composed of layer upon layer of thick rye straw, dried reeds and heather, packed tightly together and bound with split willow switches to a framework of heavy ash rafters. Over the weeks of the deep freeze, this thick thatch had become coated in a dense, uniform layer of hard frost, transforming the roofs into smooth, white slopes that gleamed faintly under the pale winter sky, looking more like natural hills of ice than human habitations. Beneath this heavy white canopy, the walls of the dwellings offered a formidable defense against the creeping cold of the plateau. Constructed from a double framework of split oak posts, the intervening space was filled with a dense hand-packed mixture of wet clay, chopped straw, and animal hair, a traditional wattle and daub technique that created a seamless, insulated barrier. As the permafrost deepened outside, this mixture had dried and hardened into a substance as solid as stone, its outer surface showing the faint, frozen impressions of the hands that had smoothed it into place during the warm days of late summer. The low wooden doors, carved from thick slabs of seasoned oak and reinforced with heavy iron bars, fit tightly into their frames, their edges sealed with strips of sheepskin to prevent even the slightest draught of freezing air from penetrating the domestic interior. Inside the longhouses, the atmosphere was one of absolute enclosure, a dim and peaceful sanctuary where the passage of the winter days was measured solely by the slow consumption of the firewood. There were no windows to let in the glaring white light of the snowfields. Instead, the illumination came entirely from the central stone-lined hearth, whose amber flames rose and fell in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The smoke from the oak logs climbed slowly into the high rafters, creating a permanent aromatic canopy of blue-grey haze that insulated the upper spaces before drifting lazily out through a small, protected smoke hole at the gable end. Along the walls, sturdy wooden benches covered with thick sheepskins and coarse woolen blankets provided comfortable seating for the family, while the earth floor, packed hard by generations of footsteps, retained the gentle ambient warmth of the fire. This architectural harmony created a sense of profound safety and quiet community that allowed the villagers to face the challenges of the season without despair. In the small lanes between the houses, the snow and fine rime had been packed down into firm white paths that connected every doorway, forming a mini network of communication that kept the settlement unified despite the isolation of the landscape. Even as the livestock stood quiet in their dark stalls and the surface waters remained locked in silence, the village remained a living, breathing entity, its heart beating steadily within the thick timber walls. It was a structure built for endurance, a patient bastion of human life perched on the edge of a frozen world, prepared to hold its ground against the elements through the collective strength of its ancient design. At the western edge of the settlement, slightly removed from the timber longhouses to protect the thatched roofs from stray sparks, stood the village smithy, a low, sturdy structure built entirely from unhewn limestone blocks and roofed with thick, heavy turf that had now frozen into a solid mound of earth and rime. Inside, the forge existed in a state of solemn, cold dormancy before the day's labour began. The air was thick with the distinct metallic perfume of old iron rust, the sharp tang of wood ash, and the deep, rich aroma of cold charcoal stored in great wicker baskets along the wall. The master smith, a man whose shoulders had been broadened by decades of swinging the heavy-turning hammer, moved through the dim workspace with a slow, deliberate step that echoed softly on the hard-packed earthen floor. The tools of his craft, tongs of various lengths, heavy iron swages, and the great anvil itself, bolted firmly to a massive stump of seasoned oak that reached deep into the ground, lay perfectly still in the pale morning light that filtered through the narrow window slits. The anvil's polished steel surface reflected a soft grey sheen, mirroring the overcast sky outside, waiting for the return of heat and life to the quiet stone workshop. With methodical care, the smith began to evaluate the village's collective inventory of iron, an asset more precious than gold in this remote highland territory. In the 9th century, iron was won through grueling labour from small bloomery furnaces, resulting in a metal that was tough and resilient but required constant maintenance and skilled manipulation to withstand the pressure of solid bedrock. He reached into a dark corner of the workshop and retrieved a bundle of heavy iron bars and long, thick wedges that had been forged during the lighter days of autumn. As his rough, soot-stained fingers traced the cold contours of the metal, he looked for any hidden flaws, microscopic fissures, or soft spots that might cause the tool to fail when struck against the unyielding limestone. Each piece of iron was heavy and cold, drawing the natural warmth from his hands as he lifted it to his eyes to inspect the weld lines where steel edges had been expertly fused to the softer iron bodies, a technique designed to conserve the rarest, hardest metal for the absolute tip of the cutting edge. The collection of tools gathered on the thick oak workbench formed a silent army of steel and iron organized by size, weight, and specific function in the upcoming trial. There were massive, square-headed sledgehammers weighing many pounds, their ash wood handles selected from the straightest grain and polished smooth by years of friction with calloused palms. Alongside them lay dozens of short, stocky chisels, specifically shaped to bite into stone rather than wood, their heads mushroomed slightly from previous seasons of quarrying, a testament to their long history of service to the community. The smith checked the balance of each hammer, ensuring that the iron head was securely wedged onto its wooden haft, for any looseness would be dangerous in the narrow confines of the well shaft. He ran a broad thumb over the blunt wedge-shaped tips of the stone chisels, visualizing the precise angle needed to split the fire-weakened limestone layers without shattering the precious iron itself, a delicate balance of form and utility that only an experienced eye could truly discern. Satisfied with his inspection, the smith turned to the cold hearth and began the slow, rhythmic process of awakening the forge fire. He laid a small nest of dry birch bark and fine pine shavings into the center of the iron basin, striking a piece of flint against a hardened steel striker until a tiny, brilliant spark caught the tinder. With patient, gentle breaths, he coaxed the fragile spark into a steady flame, slowly adding small pieces of oak charcoal that crackled softly as they caught the heat. The great leather bellows, operated by a long wooden lever, began to sigh with a regular, measured respiration, sending a precise stream of air into the heart of the coals. The deep cherry-red glow of the charcoal rapidly transformed into a brilliant incandescent yellow-orange, casting a warm, vibrant light that banished the grey shadows from the limestone walls and filled the room with a comforting, radiant heat. The tools were now laid near the edge of the hearth, their cold iron bodies gradually absorbing the ambient warmth of the forge, prepared to be heated to a bright crimson and hammered to a perfect, razor-sharp finish, ready to begin their monumental descent into the dark, frozen core of the ancient plateau. As the pale morning light expanded across the eastern rim of the high plateau, it touched the distant, quiet fringes of the ancient forest that bordered the agricultural settlement. This woodland was a vast primeval expanse of towering beech, dense hornbeam, and gnarled, ancestral oaks that had stood watch over the stone highlands for centuries. In the winter months, the forest underwent a profound architectural transformation, its summer canopy replaced by an intricate, grey and white labyrinth of bare branches that silhouetted cleanly against the cold slate sky. Every trunk and slender twig was meticulously wrapped in a thick sleeve of crystalline rime, turning the entire wooded boundary into a silent palace of silver and glass. The floor of the forest, covered in a deep carpet of fallen autumn leaves, had been frozen into a solid, crunchy crust that amplified the slightest sound, creating a natural amphitheatre where the only noise was the occasional sharp snap of an ice-laden branch breaking under its own immense weight in the deep, undisturbed interior. The coordination of the wood collection was approached with the same quiet, systematic gravity that characterized all communal endeavors on the Carolingian frontier. Small groups of villagers, muffled in heavy woolen cloaks and sheepskin tunics, moved out along the frozen pathways toward the forest edge, bringing with them sturdy wooden sledges equipped with wide runners designed to slide smoothly over the icy rime. They were not seeking green wood, which would burn with a sputtering, inefficient flame and produce an intolerable amount of dense, choking smoke within the narrow confines of a well shaft. Instead, their eyes were trained on the naturally cured deadwood, the massive limbs and fallen trunks that had rested on the forest floor for years, dried by the mountain sun and cured by the clean winds until all sap had evaporated, leaving behind a dense, highly concentrated fuel capable of generating the absolute, intense heat required for thermal fracturing. Handling the frozen wood was a sensory experience of pure endurance and tactile clarity. The bark of the ancient oak logs was rough, cold, and encrusted with delicate patterns of frozen lichen that crumbled like dry sugar under the touch of thick leather mittens. When the workers lifted the smaller logs into the sledges, the wood emitted a clear, hollow ring, a dry sound that confirmed the total absence of internal moisture and promised a clean, fiercely hot burn. The gathering proceeded in a slow, rhythmic cadence. There was no shouting or hurried movement, for the bitter cold demanded a careful conservation of breath and physical energy. Each piece of wood was selected with an educated eye, matching the thickness of the log to the specific stage of the upcoming fire-setting process. The heavier trunks were reserved for the base of the deep, subterranean fires, while the slender branches of birch and ash were gathered to serve as kindling, their papery bark acting as a natural tinder to awaken the flames. The journey back to the village was a slow, meditative procession across the undulating white fields of the plateau. The wooden sledges, laden with high geometric stacks of silver-grey beech and dark, heavy oak, creaked softly as they were drawn over the frozen ground by patient draft oxen, whose breath rolled from their wide nostrils in great slow clouds of white mist that dissolved into the freezing air. The path followed the natural contours of the limestone ridges, where the wind had swept the stone bare, creating a smooth, dark track against the white landscape. The workers walked alongside the sledges, their boots leaving temporary, shallow impressions on the hard rime, their faces turned away from the gentle, persistent nip of the north wind. There was a profound, quiet dignity in this collective movement, a shared understanding that each log hauled from the forest edge was a vital component of the village's defense against the encroaching shadow of thirst. Upon reaching the designated well site in the center of the settlement, the gathered fuel was organized into a massive protective wall of wood that surrounded the excavation zone. The master builders supervised the stacking, ensuring that the logs were raised in neat, well-ventilated tiers that would remain dry and accessible even if a sudden mountain blizzard should descend upon the plateau. The cut ends of the oak logs revealed a beautiful, tight grain, the concentric rings of growth displaying decades of natural history, now laid open to serve the immediate survival of the community. This great reservoir of firewood stood as a silent monument to the foresight and cooperation of the village, an architectural bank of potential heat that would soon be called upon to contend with the ancient bedrock, ensuring that when the first fires were lit, the community would possess the enduring resources to carry their light down into the deepest, darkest foundations of the earth. In the exact geometric center of the village common, a spot chosen by the elders where the hidden orientation of the limestone ridges suggested the shortest path to the deep waters, the ground had been cleared of its light covering of loose rime. The space was marked out by a circle of large, unhewn river stones, each block cold and heavy, placed end to end to serve as a retaining boundary for the fire that would begin their descent. For weeks, this piece of earth had been exposed to the absolute chill of the northern sky, and its surface was as smooth and unyielding as a polished anvil. The master builders knelt upon the frozen ground, their thick woolen cloaks pooling around them in the pale grey light as they began the meticulous architecture of the first fire. They laid down a foundation of the lightest, driest birch bark, peeled in thin, curly ribbons that rattled softly like dry parchment in the faint winter breeze. Over this delicate layer they carefully crisscrossed slender splinters of fat, rich pine wood, resinous and golden, which had been split by the smith to serve as the vital kindling that would carry the heat down into the heavier logs. The awakening of the first flame was performed with a quiet, reverent precision that drew a small, silent circle of onlookers from the nearby longhouses. The master of the fire held a heavy piece of dark flint in one hand and a curved iron striker in the other, his movements slow and deliberate to conserve his energy against the biting air. With a sharp, practiced stroke, he brought the iron down against the sharp edge of the stone. A tiny cluster of brilliant orange-white sparks cascaded into the nest of birch bark, disappearing for a brief, breathless moment into the dry fibers. Then a thin, delicate thread of pale white smoke began to curl upward, carrying the sweet, pungent aroma of burning resin. The firemaster leaned low, his warm breath moving in a slow, steady stream to coax the fragile ember until a bright yellow flame suddenly leaped forth, licking hungrily at the pine splinters and casting a sudden warm radiance across the frosted stone boundary. Slowly, systematically, the larger logs of split oak and seasoned beech were introduced to the growing fire, built upward in a precise pyramid that allowed the cold mountain air to draw evenly through the fuel. The wood did not sputter or resist. It had been cured so perfectly by the sun and wind that it accepted the flame completely, the dark bark fracturing silently as the intense heat began to take hold. Within an hour, the modest kindling had transformed into a roaring, majestic beacon, its core glowing with an intense, incandescent orange light that defied the grey monotony of the winter sky. The sound of the fire became the new voice of the village common, a deep, rhythmic crackling punctuated by the sharp, musical snaps of expanding pockets of old wood sap. Great plumes of thick, dark wood smoke rose straight up into the breathless atmosphere, a monolithic column of blue and charcoal that could be seen from the furthest ridges of the plateau, signalling to the lonely landscape that the community had begun its long struggle against the frost. As the core temperature of the fire reached its peak, the true work began at the boundary, where the intense heat met the rock-hard permafrost of the surface layer. The earth beneath the fire, which had been frozen solid for months, began to experience a profound structural disruption. The millions of tiny ice crystals locked within the dark loam began to liquefy, creating a low, continuous sizzling sound as the moisture turned to steam and rose through the burning embers. The hard, metallic crust of the ground gradually softened, turning from a surface as unyielding as iron into a dark, rich mud that bubbled softly under the pressure of the heat. The air around the well site filled with a complex sensory tapestry, the sharp, clean scent of burning oak mingling with the deep primordial odor of damp, thawed earth that had been sealed away since the middle of autumn. It was a localized resurrection of springtime, a small, warm oasis of activity and life carved directly out of the heart of the absolute winter, showing the villagers that even the most stubborn frost could be melted by the persistent application of purposeful warmth. When the great fire had burned down to a thick, undulating bed of deep crimson coals, having completed its initial task of thawing the iron-hard crust of the plateau, the master builders gave the signal to begin the physical extraction of the earth. Using long, heavy rakes carved from green ash wood that resisted the lingering heat, the workers systematically shifted the glowing embers and smoking ash to an adjacent stone-lined staging area, preserving the precious coals for the next cycle of the burn. As the cleared ground was suddenly exposed to the absolute freezing air of the mountain morning, a monumental column of thick white steam billowed upward from the site, rolling in slow, majestic clouds that briefly enveloped the workers in a warm, moist shroud. This sudden cloud carried the heavy, rich fragrance of deep primeval soil, an organic scent of old roots and ancient moisture that had been trapped beneath the frost since the middle of autumn, contrasting sharply with the dry, sterile cold of the winter wind that swept across the outer fields. With the coals safely removed, the diggers stepped forward into the circular enclosure, their heavy leather boots pressing into a dark, steaming mire where the permafrost had been successfully dissolved into a rich, pliable clay. They carried with them the village's primary excavating tools, heavy, broad-bladed mattocks and sturdy wooden spades tipped with thick shoes of hammered iron, which had been greased with lard to prevent the wet earth from adhering to the metal. The work proceeded in an environment of focused, non-verbal coordination. One team of men pushed the iron-shod spades into the soft, warm mud, lifting massive, heavy clods of dark loam that glistened with melted moisture under the grey sky. They deposited the soil into deep, tightly woven willow baskets and heavy buckets carved from hollowed logs, which were then hauled away by a secondary line of workers, who deposited the material along the northern perimeter of the common to form a low, protective rampart against the biting winds. The rhythmic sound of the excavation became the new cadence of the morning. There was the soft, rhythmic squelch of iron blades slicing through the warm clay, followed by the low, hollow thump of the heavy earth hitting the bottoms of the wooden hampers. The workers moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace, conserving their breath and energy, their movements as regular and predictable as the swinging of a pendulum. As they dug deeper, passing through the first 12 inches of thawed topsoil, the temperature of the mud began to drop noticeably, transitioning from the near scald of the fire's core to a damp, chilling cold that numbed the fingers through thick leather gloves. The color of the earth shifted as well, turning from the rich, organic black of the surface loam to a lighter yellowish clay packed tightly with small, angular fragments of weathered shale and flint that rasped sharply against the iron edges of the spades. By midday, the excavation had reached a depth where the tools began to encounter a fundamentally different level of physical resistance. The soft, yielding progress of the upper clay gave way to a dull metallic clink as the iron blades struck a continuous horizontal surface that did not give or splinter under human strength. The diggers dropped to their knees using short, blunt iron scrapers and stiff brooms made from tightly bound birch twigs to meticulously clear away the remaining films of wet silt and loose gravel. Underneath their hands, the true foundation of the plateau began to reveal itself for the first time in centuries. It was the upper shelf of the great limestone bedrock, a vast pale grey expanse that looked, in the flat light of the winter day, like the skin of a massive, sleeping creature that had been buried beneath the hills since the dawn of time. The exposed stone was matte and cool, its surface etched with a complex network of fine hairline fissures and microscopic depressions where the mineral had dried over eons of geological pressure. Despite its absolute hardness, the stone still retained a faint residual warmth from the monumental fire that had raged above it, causing thin, ghostly wisps of vapor to rise from its grey face like smoke from an altar. The master builders leaned over the rim of the shallow pit, their eyes scanning the smooth, pale surface of the rock with a quiet, analytical intensity, tracing the alignment of the natural grain and identifying the weak points where the next fire would be set. The village had successfully stripped away the superficial mantle of the earth, and now they stood face to face with the true adversary, the ancient silent stone that they would have to pierce, foot by foot, through the dark winter days that lay ahead. When the midnight hour arrived over the high stony plateau, the sky transformed into a vast seamless vault of deep obsidian, pierced by thousands of brilliant, unblinking stars that shone with a cold diamond-like intensity through the thin mountain air. The great constellations of the northern hemisphere, the Great Bear, the Hunter, and the steady guiding light of the North Star, wheeled across the heavens with an absolute majestic slowness, their ancient silver trajectories marking the silent passage of the winter night. Far below this celestial display, the village sat wrapped in a profound and heavy darkness, its timber longhouses appearing as faint, shadow-like contours against the white, frost-covered earth. Yet in the very centre of the settlement, the newly opened well site remained a small, vibrant island of warmth and light, a solitary beacon of human purpose operating in defiance of the immense, freezing void that characterised the Carolingian night. To sustain the labour through the longest, coldest hours without interruption, the elders had established a strict, rotating system of communal shifts, ensuring that no single villager would succumb to the paralysing effects of the frost or the deep fatigue of the heavy work. Every 3 hours, as the stars shifted their positions by a predictable measure, a quiet transition occurred at the rim of the pit. The workers who had been labouring in the cold air would step back, their arms heavy and their faces dusted with fine grey ash, to be replaced by a fresh group of neighbours who emerged silently from the warmth of the nearby longhouses. This rotation was conducted with a remarkable, non-verbal fluidity. There was no shouting, no loud commands, and no unnecessary movement to break the solemn stillness of the night. Instead, the transition was marked by low sympathetic murmurs, the gentle passing of heavy leather mittens, and the sharing of a warm wooden mug of herbal broth by the small staging hearth that was kept perpetually burning near the wood piles. Around the perimeter of the circular excavation, several long pine torches were fixed securely into iron rings driven into heavy wooden posts, their resinous knots crackling softly as they burned. The amber flames of these torches danced and flickered in the faint night breeze, casting long dramatic shadows that stretched across the common and crawled up the steep, frosted slopes of the surrounding thatched roofs. The light illuminated the focused faces of the watchmen, highlighting the frost that had gathered on their eyebrows and the wool of their hoods, while casting a warm, golden glow down into the shallow pit where the grey limestone shelf lay exposed. In this subterranean workspace, the air was still and held a unique dual quality, the sharp, piercing chill of the winter night mixing continuously with the dry, radiating heat of the stone floor, which still retained the memory of the great surface fire that had cleared away the permafrost. The work during this nocturnal phase focused on preparing the exposed limestone bedrock for the first true instance of deep thermal fracturing. The villagers moved with a slow, rhythmic cadence that mirrored the steady turning of the stars above. 2 men knelt on the smooth, grey floor of the pit, using small, hand-forged iron chisels to gently clear away the microscopic fragments of shale and loose mineral dust that had accumulated in the natural depressions of the rock. Every strike of their wooden mallets against the iron tools was deliberate and measured, producing a low, rhythmic clink, clink, clink. that echoed softly within the shallow stone chamber and drifted out over the silent, sleeping village like a mechanical heartbeat. There was no haste in their movements. They worked with the patient, enduring precision of craftsmen who understood that the stone could not be forced by brute strength, but had to be understood, measured, and coaxed open through a systematic application of traditional skill. As the second watch of the night drew to a close, the workers began to lay the foundations for the next fire directly upon the cleansed limestone floor. They arranged the split logs of seasoned oak and beech in a precise circular pattern, leaving narrow air channels between the timbers to ensure a clean, fiercely hot burn that would push the heat deep into the mineral layers below. Each log was handled with care, its rough bark cold to the touch, adding to the growing geometric structure that would soon contend with the ancient bedrock. The collective effort of the night shift stood as a silent monument to the unity of the settlement, a quiet demonstration of human warmth and determination working in perfect harmony under the watchful gaze of the winter constellations, preserving the spark of life on the high plateau while the rest of the world slept in the deep embrace of the frost. With the second great fire having run its course, consuming the stacked oak logs until they were reduced to a silent glowing bed of dense grey ash, the surface of the ancient limestone shelf was left in a state of extreme thermal tension. The intense, concentrated heat of the flames had penetrated several inches into the crystalline structure of the rock, forcing the mineral matrix to expand rapidly against its own monumental weight. Then, as the workers cleared the remaining embers away, exposing the hot stone to the sudden biting onslaught of the sub-zero mountain air, the physical phenomenon of thermal shock took hold. A series of faint, sharp popping sounds, like the snapping of dry twigs in a distant forest, echoed from the bottom of the shallow pit as the rapid cooling caused the stone to contract violently. Hairline fractures, thin and intricate as spiderwebs, began to bloom across the pale face of the limestone, marring its pristine surface and creating small, vulnerable fissures where the iron tools could finally find a purchase. The master diggers stepped down into the narrow workspace, their breath forming thick silver clouds that rose to meet the flickering light of the pine torches. They carried with them the heavy, hand-forged stone chisels and massive iron-headed sledgehammers that the village blacksmith had spent the previous hours tempering at his forge. The iron was cold, drawing the warmth from the thick leather gloves of the men, yet its heavy weight felt reassuring in their hands, a tangible extension of human will ready to be measured against the geological endurance of the plateau. Positioning the broad, wedge-shaped tip of the first chisel against a freshly cracked vein in the stone, the primary digger braced his body, his knees pressing into the dry, chalky dust that coated the floor of the excavation. A second worker raised a heavy wooden mallet, its ashwood handle smooth and balanced, and brought it down with a slow, deliberate swing onto the flat head of the iron tool. The resulting sound was a sharp, clear ring that shattered the absolute stillness of the winter night, a musical and metallic note that rose from the depths of the pit and rippled out across the sleeping village. Keng, 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 the cadence established itself immediately, regular and unhurried, matching the slow, steady rhythm of a resting heartbeat. It was a dry, resonant sound that spoke of immense resistance met by unyielding patience. With every blow of the mallet, the iron chisel bit deeper into the heat-weakened limestone, driving its wedge shape into the microscopic fractures and forcing the stone to give way. Small, angular flakes of grey rock and fine, powdery white mineral dust began to splinter off from the bedrock, flying outward to land softly on the earth around the pit's rim. The air within the shaft rapidly became thick with the dry, chalky scent of pulverized limestone, a clean, ancient smell that mingled with the lingering aroma of oak smoke and resinous torchwood. This rhythmic labor required a profound non-verbal synchronization between the two men working in the dark. The one holding the chisel had to turn the iron tool slightly after each strike, shifting its angle by a fraction of an inch to ensure that the stone was chipped away evenly rather than merely crushed into dust. His hands experienced a continuous, jarring vibration with every impact, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that travelled up the iron shaft through his thick leather mitts. and into the bones of his arms and shoulders. Yet there was a meditative peace in this repetition. The workers did not fight the stone with frantic, erratic movements. They moved with a disciplined, cyclical grace, conserving their physical energy for the long hours of the watch. The sound of their progress became a steady anchor in the night, a reassuring declaration to the entire settlement that despite the freezing dark and the locked surface streams, the community was actively carving its way towards salvation. If you find a sense of peace in these forgotten echoes of human endurance, and wish to accompany us further as we uncover history's deep and steady rhythms, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing these quiet journeys. Your presence supports our ongoing exploration of the silent, resilient paths walked by those who came before us. Overhead, the vast canopy of stars continued its slow, silent rotation across the black void of the sky, completely indifferent to the tiny metallic noises rising from the high plateau. Inside the darkened longhouses, the villagers shifted under their wool blankets, the distant, familiar sound of the chisel acting as a comforting lullaby that assured them their neighbours were watching over the common, keeping the hope of life alive. Foot by foot, the iron asserted its slow dominion over the ancient bedrock, converting the monolithic stone shelf into a beautifully textured, hand-carved monument of human cooperation that grew deeper with every passing turn of the night. The phenomenon that occurred at the base of the deepening shaft was a silent elemental collision between two extreme states of matter, a magnificent display of natural laws operating within the narrow confines of the ancient limestone bedrock. For hours, the intense, concentrated core of the oak fire had driven its thermal energy deep into the stone, forcing the tightly packed molecules of calcium carbonate to absorb an immense amount of heat. Under this profound energetic saturation, the grey limestone had expanded, its internal matrix stretching past its traditional boundaries, storing a tremendous amount of latent physical tension within its dark, silent layers. Now, with the glowing embers meticulously cleared away by the workers' long ashwood rakes, the hot, vulnerable face of the rock was suddenly left entirely bare, exposed directly to the absolute, sub-zero current of the northern mountain air that pooled naturally within the earth excavation. The response of the ancient bedrock to this sudden, violent drop in temperature was immediate, profound, and entirely independent of human strength. As the freezing air rushed down into the pit, it collided with the radiating surface of the stone, creating a sharp localized atmospheric boundary where thin, ghostly wisps of shimmering heat vapor rose and dissolved in a frantic, silent dance. The outer micron layers of the limestone, cooling at an incredibly rapid rate compared to the deeply heated core below, began to contract with a sudden irresistible force. Because the stone was inherently rigid, unable to accommodate such a rapid and uneven structural transformation, its ancient crystalline lattice began to give way from within. A series of minuscule internal alignments were broken, releasing the stored thermal energy not in a loud explosion, but in a beautiful complex symphony of delicate, high-pitched sounds that filled the bottom of the dark shaft. To the ears of the master builders who leaned over the rim of the pit, this natural fracturing produced a captivating and deeply meditative tapestry of noise. It began with a faint, rhythmic ticking, sound remarkably similar to the slow mechanical turning of an ancient water wheel or the light stepping of birds across a frozen tiled roof. This delicate cadence rapidly expanded into a series of distinct sharp snaps and crystalline pings that resonated through the solid bedrock like the plucking of tightly wound iron strings. Each individual sound signaled the birth of a new fracture, a clean, natural split occurring deep within the mineral matrix where the dense grey stone was forced to relieve its internal pressures. These hairline fissures, completely unguided by human hands, traced the paths of least resistance across the bedrock, winding gracefully around the harder nodules of flint and following the ancient, horizontal bedding planes that had been deposited by primordial seas millions of years before. Visually, the surface of the stone underwent a stunning transformation that could be traced by the flickering, amber light of the pine torches. Across the smooth, matte face of the grey limestone, a delicate, pale network of spiderweb lines began to bloom, spreading outward from the center of the burn zone like frost expanding across a clear window pane. These cracks were remarkably fine, yet they possessed a stark structural finality that permanently altered the monolithic character of the rock shelf. In some areas where the thermal shock had been particularly intense, the upper layers of the stone began to lift and splinter naturally, their edges curling upward by a fraction of an inch to reveal the lighter, chalky white mineral configurations that lay just beneath the weathered exterior. The air within the shaft became heavily saturated with the clean, dry scent of split stone, a sharp mineral aroma that carried a faint trace of ancient sulfur and pulverized earth, reminding the workers of the deep primordial forces they were gently awakening through their patient application of flame and frost. This process of natural degradation demonstrated the profound efficacy of the fire-setting art, proving that patience and an understanding of the Earth's internal physics could achieve what brute force and iron alone could never master. The villagers stood in quiet observation around the wellhead, allowing the natural laws of contraction and expansion to complete their silent labor before introducing the heavy sledges and chisels. There was no need to rush the elements. The frost outside and the heat within were performing the primary work of excavation, systematically converting a monumental, unyielding shield of solid bedrock into a collection of fractured, manageable fragments that could be easily lifted toward the sky. It was a beautiful cooperative rhythm between human intention and the unhurried laws of the universe, a slow and steady unraveling of the plateau's defenses that brought the community one step closer to the living waters sleeping in the dark below. As the new stack of seasoned oak and birch logs caught the nascent flames at the base of the excavation, the physical manifestation of their labor assumed a visual form that ascended far automotive past the stony lips of the well shaft. A dense, majestic column of pale blue and charcoal-tinted wood smoke began its slow, deliberate migration toward the heavens, rising straight and unbroken through the breathless mountain air. Because the night was utterly devoid of wind, the air currents remaining as still and unmoving as the frozen limestone cliffs themselves, the smoke did not scatter or drift erratically across the village common. Instead, it formed a monumental vertical pillar of vapor, a soft and shifting architectural column that seemed to connect the absolute depths of the subterranean pit with the infinite expanses of the northern sky. The smoke moved with an almost imperceptible liquid grace, its edges curling inward in slow, lazy spirals that caught the ambient amber glow of the pine torches below, before transitioning into a quiet, ghostly silver as it escaped the ring of human light and entered the vast domain of the nocturnal cold. This ascending column of vapor carried with it the aromatic soul of the ancient forest, filling the crisp highland atmosphere with a deep, comforting fragrance that spoke of warmth, endurance, and quiet domesticity. It was a rich tapestry of scents, the sharp, clean perfume of burning birch bark mingling seamlessly with the heavy, long-lasting aroma of seasoned oak heartwood and the faint, sweet trace of old pine resin. As the smoke climbed higher, passing the dark gables of the timber longhouses and the pale, frosted slopes of the thatched roofs, it cooled gradually, its density thinning until it resembled a delicate, transparent veil of fine gossamer draped across the dark velvet background of the night. The villagers who stood watch at the surface followed the trajectory of this silver thread with their eyes, their faces turned upward toward the great celestial dome, finding a profound, meditative peace in the regular, unhurried ascent of the smoke which served as a silent indicator of the steady work continuing deep within the earth. Far above the highest plumes of the rising smoke, the sky existed in a state of absolute crystalline clarity, a deep and infinite ocean of indigo and obsidian that seemed to have been washed clean by the intense mountain frost. There were no clouds to obscure the view, nor any moisture left in the upper atmosphere to blur the sharp, piercing light of the stars. The great constellations of the 9th century winter sky hung directly overhead, positioned with a geometric precision that had guided travelers and farmers for eons. The silver dust of the Milky Way arched across the center of the firmament like a vast glittering highway of cosmic ice, its millions of faint, distant suns casting a soft, collective luminescence that touched the dark ridges of the plateau with a pale, ghostly light. The primary stars, the steady guiding point of Polaris, the brilliant diamonds of the celestial hunter's belt, and the wide, sweeping curve of the Great Bear, shone with a fierce, unblinking intensity that seemed to vibrate in harmony with the cold, thin air of the high altitude. As the highest, most delicate tendrils of the wood smoke reached the upper tiers of the atmosphere, a beautiful visual illusion manifested for those who watched from the wellhead. The pale silver-grey vapor began to merge organically with the distant canopy of stars, its thinning fibers weaving effortlessly through the intricate patterns of the constellations. In the dim light, it became impossible to discern where the earthly smoke ended and the celestial light began. The tiny, incandescent particles of ash that floated lazily within the current appeared to transform into new microscopic stars, flickering briefly before dissolving into the vast cosmic tapestry. The smoke seemed to stain the dark blue of the sky with a soft milky haze, softening the sharp edges of the stellar diamonds and creating a gentle, luminous pathway that mirrored the ancient trajectories of the universe. It was a moment of profound unity, a visual marriage between the immediate physical struggles of the small Carolingian village and the timeless, unchanging majesty of the cosmos, wrapping the entire plateau in an atmosphere of deep, unyielding tranquility. This slow blending of smoke and starlight served as a comforting reminder of the larger order that enveloped their isolated world, reassuring the community that their small, hand caracis of life was a recognized part of the great living fabric of the earth and sky. The rhythmic crackle of the fire below and the silent movement of the stars above operated in a shared harmonious tempo, a grand cyclical dance of heat and cold, light and shadow. Inside the dark pens, the livestock avenues seemed to settle into a deeper, quieter rest, their heavy breathing synchronizing with the slow rise of the smoke, while within the longhouses, the sleeping children dreamed of warm springs and running water, insulated from the absolute winter by the sturdy timber walls and the watchful care of the night shift. The column of smoke continued its steady, upright journey, a continuous offering of human warmth rising into the frozen dark, preserving the hope of life on the high plateau under the eternal, silent gaze of the winter stars. As the hours of continuous excavation lengthened into the deep, frozen expanse of the mountain night, the monumental resistance of the ancient limestone plateau began to leave an undeniable mark upon the primary instruments of human will. Although the village blacksmith had tempered each chisel with the utmost care, the brutal reality of driving iron into fire-weakened bedrock for hours on end subjected the metal to an extraordinary degree of physical stress. At the base of the dark shaft, where the flickering torchlight illuminated the small, determined team of diggers, the sharp, pristine cutting edges of the tools began to systematically degrade. Under the heavy, rhythmic impact of the ashwood sledgehammers, the wedge-shaped points of the chisels did not merely blunt. The metal itself experienced a profound crystalline fatigue. The pristine angles that had been designed to slice smoothly into the natural fissures of the rock were compressed and flattened, turned into dull, rounded edges that could no longer split the stone, but instead struck the limestone with a hollow, useless thud, sending up small clouds of fine white dust without fracturing the bedrock. This degradation manifested not only at the cutting tip, but also at the striking head of each iron tool, where the heavy sledges delivered their massive kinetic energy. Under the constant, unyielding impact, the flat, square tops of the chisels began to experience a structural phenomenon known to the craftsmen as mushrooming. The hard, tempered iron, forced to absorb thousands of individual blows against the absolute resistance of the subterranean floor, began to spread outward, flattening and splitting into irregular, overlapping layers that resembled the ragged cap of a wild fungus. These metal splinters were a clear sign of the intense pressure operating within the narrow stone pit, a visual testament to the heavy work that was slowly draining the utility from their finest tools. When a chisel reached this state of exhaustion, it could no longer hold a straight line against the rock grain. Its balance compromised and its structural integrity threatened by the microscopic fractures creeping through the iron body. To maintain the steady, uninterrupted momentum of the excavation, a continuous transport chain was established between the cold rim of the well shaft and the glowing warmth of the village smithy. The exhausted, blunted chisels were gathered by the watchmen and placed into thick leather buckets, their cold, distorted bodies clinking together with a dull, metallic rattle that sounded like heavy chains moving through the dark lanes. Carrying these buckets across the frost-covered common, the workers entered the sanctuary of the stone workshop, where the master smith stood ready at his anvil, his face illuminated by the vibrant, dancing orange light of the active forge. The transition from the sub-zero chill of the open plateau to the intense radiating heat of the charcoal fire was profound, a physical boundary where the cold iron was gently accepted back into the elemental cradle of its creation, to be cleansed of its fatigue and restored to its proper form. The process of restoration began with the slow, methodical heating of the worn tools within the incandescent core of the forge. Using long iron tongs that clutched the blunted chisels with a firm, practiced grip, the smith buried the metal deep within the bed of glowing oak charcoal, where the forced air from the leather bellows created a localized environment of intense thermal energy. The villagers watched in quiet fascination as the dark, cold iron slowly absorbed the heat, its color changing in a beautiful, predictable spectrum, moving from a dull, shadowy gray to a deep, blood red, then a vibrant crimson, and finally achieving a brilliant, glowing cherry orange that matched the intensity of the coals themselves. In this highly heated state, the internal stresses that had locked themselves into the metal during the long hours of striking the limestone were dissolved, the crystalline matrix of the iron becoming pliable, responsive, and ready once more to receive the corrective geometry of the craftsman's hammer. Lifting the glowing, translucent chisel from the fire, the smith swung it through the dim air of the workshop, leaving a brief, amber trail of light before placing the hot iron upon the polished, mirror-like face of the heavy anvil. The sound of the smithy shifted immediately into a high-pitched musical cadence, a sharp, ringing rhythm of the handhammer striking the hot metal, punctuated by the deep, hollow boom of the heavy sledge as it helped reshape the stubborn wedge. Under these measured, powerful blows, the mushroomed edges of the striking head were rapidly folded back into a neat, solid square, while the blunted tip was drawn out once more into a long, aggressive taper, its cutting edge refined and straightened by the precise placement of the hammer blows. Small black flakes of oxidized iron scale flew outward from the anvil with every strike, falling to the dirt floor like tiny stars, while the restored tool gradually cooled through shades of deep red and dark grey, prepared to undergo the final, critical transition of tempering before returning to the dark depths of the well shaft to face the ancient limestone once again. While the relentless metallic ring of the iron chisels continued to anchor the frozen night outside, a different kind of quiet purpose was unfolding within the smoky sanctuary of the village kitchens. In the smaller auxiliary longhouses where the community's hearths were dedicated to the daily preparation of food, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, enveloping warmth that offered a stark contrast to the sterile chill of the open plateau. Here the fires were kept low, steady, and deliberate, tended by hands that moved with the slow, hereditary grace of long experience. Great cauldrons of beaten bronze and thick cast iron hung suspended from heavy blackened chains attached to the structural ridgepoles of the roof, swinging almost imperceptibly as the rising heat currents caressed their dark, soot-encrusted bellies. The light in these spaces was soft and deeply amber, emanating entirely from the deep beds of glowing willow and alder embers that crackled with a gentle, papery whisper, casting a serene radiance across the smooth timber posts and the simple domestic implements arranged along the walls. Inside these communal kitchens, the sensory tapestry was dominated by the rhythmic, comforting sounds of manual food preparation, a gentle cadence that seemed to answer the more aggressive work occurring at the well site. In the corners of the rooms, workers sat on low three-legged stools of split beech, using small hand-turned stone querns to grind the remaining stores of dried barley and winter rye into a coarse, unbolted meal. The steady circular friction of the upper millstone grating against the stationary bedstone produced a low, earthy hum, a deep and resonant vibration that travelled through the dirt floor and filled the room with a sense of grounded security. As the golden grains were slowly crushed between the stone teeth, a clean, dusty fragrance filled the immediate air, a nostalgic scent of past harvests and late summer suns that remained trapped within the dry husks, waiting to be unlocked by the warmth of the boiling water. The preparation of the daily porridge was a slow, meditative process that brooked no individual haste. With measured movements, the cooks introduced the coarse grain into the great bubbling cauldrons, stirring the mixture continuously with long, paddle-like spoons carved from smooth ash wood that had been polished by decades of contact with boiling starches. The spoon scraped along the curved bottoms of the pots with a soft, regular sliding sound, a rhythmic friction that prevented the heavy meal from burning against the metal. Slowly, as the grain absorbed the liquid, the porridge thickened into a dense, steaming mass, its surface puckering and releasing small, heavy vents of white steam that carried the rich, substantive aroma of boiled cereal and toasted grain into the high rafters, where it mingled with the permanent canopy of oak smoke before escaping through the roof vents. Parallel to the grain pots, secondary cauldrons held a deep, nourishing broth that had been simmering since the previous twilight. This infusion was built from a careful, parsimonious selection of the village's winter reserves: large marrow bones from the livestock, dried parsnips, wild leeks, and heavy shriveled heads of winter cabbage that had been gathered from the garden plots just as the first frost began to whiten the earth in autumn. Added to this were small precious cubes of salted pork fat, which slowly dissolved into the simmering liquid, releasing a rich, savoury oil that floated in brilliant golden rings across the dark amber surface of the broth. To elevate the nourishing properties of the soup, the cooks reached into dry linen bags hanging from the beams, retrieving small handfuls of wild thyme and dried marjoram that had been gathered from the high limestone cliffs during the bright days of June. As these herbs touched the boiling water, their dried leaves uncurled, releasing a sudden vibrant fragrance of sun-baked stone and mountain hillsides that filled the dim kitchen with a beautiful, fleeting memory of summer. When the midnight shift at the wellhead reached its point of greatest exhaustion, the warm sustenance was ready to be transported across the frost-locked common. The cooks carefully ladled the steaming porridge and rich herbal broth into heavy wooden bowls carved from solid alder knots, and into deep earthenware flagons that had been preheated by the hearthstones. To protect the precious heat from the sub-zero current outside, each vessel was meticulously wrapped in multiple layers of coarse, homespun wool cloth, turning the containers into small, insulated packages of life. The carriers stepped out into the freezing darkness, walking with slow, deliberate balance along the packed rime pathways, holding the warm vessels tightly against their chests like treasures. Arriving at the rim of the pit, they passed the steaming bowls down to the waiting diggers, whose breath rose in thick silver plumes to meet the descending nourishment. As the workers wrapped their cracked, leather-gloved hands around the hot wood, absorbing the physical warmth before taking their first slow, appreciative sips of the savoury broth, a profound sense of peace and community settled over the dark shaft, proving that the human spirit on the high plateau was sustained not merely by the strength of iron and flame, but by the quiet, collective care that prepared each modern comfort in the heart of the winter village. As the steady rotation of the village shifts continued without pause through the dim, monochromatic days and the starlit nights, the excavation reached its first monumental milestone of physical depth. The floor of the shaft had sunk slowly, inch by painful inch, until the heads and shoulders of the primary diggers disappeared entirely beneath the level of the village common. To stand at the bottom of the pit now was to occupy a fundamentally new space, an intentional subterranean cylinder carved directly out of the mountain's limestone skeleton. The upper world, with its wide, snow-covered meadows and low-slung timber longhouses, had been effectively compressed into a clean, circular opening directly overhead, a distinct frame that enclosed the shifting grey clouds of the day and the brilliant winter constellations of the night. This physical transition brought a profound change in the sensory reality of the work, shifting the nature of the labour from an open-air struggle against the elements to an enclosed, intimate dialogue between human iron and ancient deep bedrock. The most immediate consequence of this depth was the creation of an unexpected acoustic and atmospheric sanctuary from the relentless northern winds that swept the high plateau. At the surface, the gale continued its low, mournful howling, buffeting the timber gables and whistling through the frozen oak groves with a piercing, bitter current. But down within the hand-cut vertical shaft, just a few feet below the Earth's mantle, the moving air lost its velocity, unable to penetrate the quiet pocket of stillness that inhabited the stone chamber. The howling of the storm was transformed into a distant, muted murmur, a soft and rhythmic whisper that passed harmlessly over the circular rim of the pit like the sound of a faraway ocean. In this structural isolation, the atmosphere inside the well became remarkably stable, entirely devoid of the sudden drafts and piercing chills that made work at the surface an exercise in raw endurance. This dampening of the wind allowed the natural sounds of the excavation to take on a deeper, more resonant character within the limestone walls. Every blow of the wooden mallet against the head of the iron chisel no longer scattered into the open air, but was captured and amplified by the vertical stone surfaces, creating a rich, metallic echo that filled the narrow space. Keng, 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 the notes were pure, clear, and rhythmic, vibrating through the bedrock and into the very bones of the men who stood upon the floor. The sound of their own breathing, slow and measured to conserve their energy, became a distinct part of the acoustic environment, a steady, soft inhalation and exhalation that synchronized naturally with the mechanical cadence of the iron tools. The air within the shaft, protected from the moving wind, retained a unique dual quality, the clean, freezing temperature of the mountain night mixing continuously with the dry, radiating warmth of the limestone walls which still held the memory of the fire-setting cycles. The physical appearance of the well's interior walls offered a beautiful, visual history of the village's collective determination, each foot of depth displaying the distinct marks of the tools that had shaped it. By the flickering amber light of the pine torches, which were now fixed to iron spikes driven directly into the rock face, the walls revealed a complex texture of hand-carved geometry. One could trace the long vertical grooves left by the broad-bladed mattocks in the upper clay, followed by the rough, splintered surfaces where the first shelves of weathered limestone had been pried loose with heavy iron levers. Below that, the stone became smoother and more uniform, its surface a mosaic of small overlapping scars left by the tips of the stone chisels, each indentation a silent monument to an individual strike of the hammer. The natural strata of the plateau were laid bare like the pages of an ancient heavy book, the pale grey limestone marbled by thin, horizontal veins of dark flint and shimmering white calcite that caught the torchlight and glittered like frozen stars in the subterranean gloom. To facilitate the removal of the fractured stone from this increasing depth, the master builders had constructed a simple, sturdy timber hoist over the mouth of the pit. 3 heavy logs of seasoned ash, lashed firmly together at the apex with thick bands of hemp rope, formed a stable tripod that straddled the circular opening. Suspended from the center of this framework, a long heavy line of braided rawhide dropped into the darkness, attached to a massive bucket carved from a single hollowed block of elm wood. The operation of this hoist proceeded with a quiet, predictable rhythm that mirrored the work below. When the bucket was filled with the heavy, angular fragments of limestone, the diggers would give a low, melodious call that rose through the shaft, signaling the watchmen at the surface to begin the slow, steady haul. The wooden framework would creak softly under the weight, a comfortable structural groan that blended harmoniously with the ring of the chisels, as the extracted stone was lifted toward the winter sky, leaving the shaft clean, orderly, and prepared to sink even deeper into the silent core of the ancient mountain. As the vertical descent into the core of the high plateau continued its slow, deliberate momentum, the physical reality of the underworld revealed itself not as a uniform mass of dark rock, but as a magnificent layered tapestry of shifting colors and textures. Each foot of depth gained by the rhythmic swings of the blacksmiths' iron chisels exposed a new page in the vast, silent chronicle of the Earth's geological history. The upper walls of the shaft, which had spent centuries in close proximity to the surface soil and the seasonal cycles of rain and frost, were characterized by a muted, weathered palette. Here the limestone was a dull, heavy grey, its surface matte and porous, stained by the slow downward percolation of dark humic acids and iron-rich clays from the topsoil above. It was a colour that absorbed the flickering amber light of the pine torches, casting deep, sombre shadows that made the early stages of the excavation feel profoundly enclosed and heavy, a dark corridor carved through the twilight of the upper crust. But as the diggers bypassed the first few fathoms, penetrating deeper into the pristine, unweathered heart of the mountain, this dull grey uniformity began to give way to a striking structural transition. The stone became noticeably denser, its grain refining into a smooth, compact matrix that resisted the iron tools with a more resonant musical ring. Along with this physical hardening, the coloration of the rock shifted slowly, moving through subtle gradients of slate, charcoal, and smoky blue. These deeper layers had never known the touch of the wind, the warmth of the sun, or the damtrusion of surface water. They existed in the absolute purity of their original sedimentation, looking as clean and sharply defined as if they had been laid down only yesterday. The torchlight striking these freshly fractured surfaces no longer dissolved into the stone but was reflected back in soft glassy facets, highlighting the intricate, horizontal bedding planes that marked the slow rhythmic accumulation of ancient mineral silt over millions of years. Within this smoky blue matrix, the first true mineral veins began to manifest, lacing the dark stone with delicate, irregular ribbons of brilliant white calcite. These crystalline deposits, formed by the slow, ancient migration of mineral-saturated water through the deepest fissures of the plateau, appeared by torchlight like veins of frozen lightning trapped within the solid rock. Some of these veins were as thin as a single thread of raw linen, tracing elegant spiderweb patterns across the smooth grey face of the well walls. Others expanded into thick, crystalline bands several inches wide, composed of thousands of tiny, interlocking rhombohedral crystals that caught the amber glare of the fire and fractured it into brilliant points of silver and cream. To touch these white pathways was to experience a texture entirely distinct from the surrounding limestone. While the grey rock was cool and chalky, the calcite veins were smooth, hard, and almost glassy, splitting with a clean, geometric precision that aided the diggers in fracturing the larger blocks. As the shift progressed deeper still, the dark blue and charcoal strata gave way entirely to a magnificent, monumental layer of pure mineral-veined white limestone. This was the true bedrock of the high country, a deep sedimentary shelf of extraordinary density and luminous clarity. The arrival of this stratum transformed the interior environment of the well shaft. Instead of the dim shadow-shrouded cavern of the upper levels, the bottom of the pit became a bright, self-illuminated sanctuary. The white stone acted as a natural mirror, capturing the flickering light of the pine torches and scattering it evenly across the circular workspace, banishing the heavy shadows and bathing the diggers in a soft, ambient glow that resembled the light of a full moon reflecting off a fresh winter snowfield. The fine dust generated by the chisels, which had previously been a dark, smoky grey, became a pristine alabaster powder that coated the leather tunics and wool hoods of the workers, turning them into pale, ghostly statues operating within a hall of pure mineral light. This slow, beautiful evolution of the stone's coloration provided the village with a visual measure of their progress, a tangible confirmation that they were successfully transitioning out of the superficial, frost-locked layers of the world and into the deep, unchanging sanctuary of the lower earth. The shifting shades of grey, blue, and luminous white stood as a silent hierarchy of time and pressure, guiding their journey with a quiet aesthetic reward that mitigated the exhausting physical toll of the labour. Every basket of pure white limestone chips that was hoisted toward the winter sky carried with it a promise of the deep waters below, showing the onlookers at the surface that the heart of their rocky home was not a place of dark, dead void, but a clean and beautifully structured kingdom of light and ancient order, waiting patiently to be opened by the persistent rhythm of human cooperation. As the well cut deeper into the plateau's core, the visual environment within the workspace transformed into a mesmerizing realm of moving shadows. The long pine torches, wedged firmly into iron brackets along the vertical walls, cast a rich amber glow that struggled continuously against the dense subterranean darkness. Because the hand-carved stone walls were naturally uneven, every ridge, tool mark, and deep cleft in the limestone caught the light dramatically, projecting elongated, dancing silhouettes that shifted with every flicker of the resinous flames. The diggers worked within this fluid canvas of light and dark, their own figures cast as massive ghostly shapes against the rock faces around them. The movement of the fire created an illusion of breathing within the stone, as if the mountain itself were silently watching the progress of the iron tools, making the restricted space feel both deeply intimate and profoundly ancient as they descended further from the light of the upper world. Outside the active mouth of the shaft, the midwinter solstice held the high plateau in a state of absolute, breathless paralysis. The northern winds had temporarily ceased, leaving the vast snowfields, frozen oak groves, and frost-shrouded timber longhouses in a heavy crystalline silence under a pale dome of grey sky. Yet this freezing stillness stood in sharp, dramatic contrast to the warm, vibrant hub of human activity at the well site. Here, the continuous burning of the fracturing fires kept the immediate ground thawed, releasing a faint, localized mist that hung heavily in the sub-zero air. The contrast was stark and symbolic, an entire frozen, unmoving world extending for miles in every direction, anchored by a single, desperate point of communal warmth and determination, where the survival of the settlement was being actively carved out of the earth during the longest night of the year. Descending further into the monumental limestone core, the workers encountered a remarkable natural transition as they finally bypassed the Earth's active frost line. Below this invisible thermal boundary, the piercing sub-zero chill of the surface atmosphere lost its power and authority entirely. The ambient temperature within the deep shaft stabilized into a permanent geothermal equilibrium that had remained undisturbed for thousands of years. The air was no longer sharp, thin, and biting, but possessed a dense, velvety mildness that insulated the diggers from the howling storms above. The white limestone walls were dry and neutral to the touch, absorbing the warmth of the fire-setting cycles and creating a quiet, subterranean sanctuary where the frantic seasonal changes of the upper world were completely forgotten, replaced by a heavy, protective stillness deep within the foundations of the land. In the narrow confines of the lower shaft, verbal communication gradually became unnecessary, replaced by an intricate system of non-verbal cooperation and an unspoken bond among the villagers. The intense physical labor of lifting the massive elmwood buckets, heavily laden with sharp fragments of fractured stone, required a seamless, intuitive coordination to conserve their internal strength. The workers adjusted their movements through subtle physical cues, the specific shifting of weight on the limestone floor, a brief lock of eyes through the shimmering torchlight, or the steady, rhythmic pull on the rawhide hoist lines. When a bucket was completely filled, a simple, practiced tap of a mallet against the iron hoop sent a clear, resonant note vibrating up the stone cylinder, coordinating the efforts of those above and below with the smooth liquid efficiency of a single community working in absolute unison. At this profound depth, the upper world seemed to disappear completely from the sensory awareness of the diggers, leaving only a self-contained universe of stone, fire, and labor. Looking upward from the floor of the pit, the mouth of the well had shrunk to a minute aperture of dark sky, making the surface village feel like a distant, unattainable memory. The only reality that remained was the immediate circle of amber torchlight and the relentless rhythmic ring of the iron chisels striking the solid bedrock. Keng, keng, keng! A clean mechanical heartbeat echoing within the vertical vault. As we sit together in the quiet heart of this ancient mountain, watching the steady descent of iron into the white bedrock, let these rhythmic echoes guide your thoughts into a state of deep, undisturbed rest. If you enjoy traveling down these peaceful corridors of human history and find comfort in the slow, enduring traditions of the past, please take a soft moment to subscribe, like, and share these stories. Your gentle support allows us to continue cultivating these quiet sanctuaries of narration, keeping the timeless memories of our ancestors alive for many nights to come. At the surface wellhead, the older generation of the settlement maintained a quiet, perpetual vigil around the glowing iron braziers. Wrapped in heavy sheepskin cloaks and homespun wool, these patriarchs and matriarchs monitored the progress of the excavation by carefully inspecting the rock fragments brought up in the elm buckets. Their calloused fingers traced the horizontal grain and density of the freshly split limestone, reading the mineral characteristics like an ancient map of the underworld. Whenever a younger worker emerged from the shaft exhausted, shivering, and covered in fine stone dust, the elders offered measured, low-toned words of historical encouragement, anchoring the morale of the entire community with the steady, unshakable patience of those who had outlasted a lifetime of highland winters. To look straight up from the absolute floor of the deep stone pit was to experience an extraordinary architectural perspective. The hand-carved walls rose like the interior of a monumental stone chimney, framing a tiny, flawless circle of the nocturnal sky at its apex. Because the deep shaft eliminated the ambient glare of the surface fires, the sky within the portal appeared as a dense, dark indigo disk of absolute clarity. The winter stars and ancient constellations moved across this narrow window with a slow, ghostly majesty. For brief intervals, bright stellar clusters like the Pleiades would gather directly within the stone rim, their icy silver light filtering down through the shadows to touch the pale limestone faces, serving as a cosmic clock that reliably marked the passing hours of the long night shift. As the depth of the shaft increased, managing the voluminous wood smoke from the continuous fracturing fires became a critical technical necessity for the survival of the diggers. To clear the stagnant haze without disrupting the work, the builders implemented a clever ventilation method using long sheets of coarse homespun linen cloth. Suspended vertically down one side of the circular cylinder on slender hazel poles, these heavy textile banners effectively partitioned the well into two distinct atmospheric corridors. By rhythmically raising and lowering the cloth from the surface, a gentle respiration was created, drawing cool, crisp air down one side while coaxing the warm, dense smoke to spiral upward along the opposite wall, successfully restoring an absolute visual clarity to the deep workspace. The excavation had now entered a pristine, immaculate matrix of mineral purity that had remained completely undisturbed for millions of years. This ancient limestone bedrock, laid down at the bottom of a prehistoric sea long before human history began, possessed a fine, compact grain that felt like unpolished porcelain beneath the workers' leather gloves. Running a hand over the freshly fractured surfaces revealed sharp, razor-like edges and smooth, concave basins entirely free of surface weathering or structural flaws. Embedded within the moon-white stone were the delicate, fossilized outlines of microscopic shells and crinoid stems, tracing an intricate mineral lace that enhanced the density of the rock, demanding a disciplined, rhythmic application of iron force to split. With the immense depth came an increasing strain on the mechanical lifelines of the project, turning the focus of the surface watch toward the endurance of the timber hoist. The heavy ashwood tripod, positioned securely over the well mouth, groaned softly under the continuous weight of the extracted stone flags. The thick hemp ropes, braided tightly by the village craftsmen, stretched and creaked as they reeled the heavy elm buckets upward through the dark gradient of the shaft. Every knot, pulley, and wooden framing member was subjected to a relentless physical test, requiring constant inspection and adjustments with animal grease to ensure that the vital connection between the deep pit and the outer world remained perfectly secure. As the midwinter weeks wore on, a quiet anxiety began to surface regarding the village's remaining firewood reserves. The intense, continuous consumption of hardwood required for the thermal fracturing cycles was rapidly depleting the stacks collected from the forest fringes before the heavy snows. The village council was forced to implement a careful, calculated rationing system, meticulously balancing the urgent fuel needs of home heating within the timber longhouses against the absolute survival requirements of the well project. Every log of seasoned oak and birch bark was treated as a precious asset, allocated with a disciplined precision to ensure that the fires at the pit side never died out before the bedrock yielded. Under the heavy weight of the solstice season, the passage of time within the settlement blurred into a peaceful, cyclical routine where individual days lost their distinct identity. Life at the well site resolved into a continuous rhythmic sequence of 4 elemental actions: fire, crack, chisel, and clear. One shift of workers would stoke the fracturing embers against the limestone face, the next would wait for the thermal shock to splinter the stone, a third would drive the iron wedges into the fissures, and the final team would clear the heavy debris into the hoist buckets. This uniform cadence became the heartbeat of the plateau, a steady, predictable loop of communal labour that neutralised the harsh uncertainties of the winter freeze. Deep within the dark stone cylinder, the physical environment at the bottom of the shaft began to undergo a subtle atmospheric change. The air, which had been consistently dry and chalky with the scent of pulverized calcium carbonate, grew noticeably heavier, carrying a faint, cool dampness that altered the fragrance of the stone. The diggers noticed that the fine mineral dust no longer floated freely in the air, but began to settle quickly onto the limestone floor. The surfaces of the bedrock, while still solid, took on a deeper, darker quality under the torchlight, suggesting the presence of an invisible, pervasive moisture operating within the microscopic pores of the stone, a silent indicator that they were approaching the hidden boundaries of the water table. Just as hope began to rise, the progress of the excavation was abruptly halted by a remarkably dense, dark mineral vein embedded horizontally across the limestone matrix. This ironstone barrier was incredibly hard, resisting the standard fire-setting cycles and blunting the tempered edges of the chisels within minutes. It was a severe geological trial that tested the collective patience and refined skills of the entire community. Rather than forcing their way through with brute strength, the master builders adjusted their technique, utilizing slower, localized heat applications and alternating the angle of their strikes to exploit the natural stress lines of the dark vein, demonstrating the enduring intelligence of traditional craftsmanship when measured against the stubborn foundations of the earth. The relentless patience of the workers finally broke the resistance of the ironstone barrier, leading the excavation into a phase of sudden acoustic transformation. As the master digger delivered a measured blow with his wooden mallet, the sound of the iron chisel striking the stone changed fundamentally, shifting from a sharp, dry and metallic ring to a hollow, deep and vibrating resonance. The vibration travelled through the handles of the tools and into the bodies of the workers, signalling a profound structural change beneath the bedrock floor. The stone was no longer a solid infinite mass. It had become a thin ceiling, vibrating over an empty space below where the subterranean forces of the mountain had carved out an open cavern over millennia. Word of the acoustic shift spread silently but rapidly through the settlement, bringing the entire village into a state of suspended, quiet anticipation at the well side. Under the vast canopy of the midnight sky, families gathered around the perimeter of the common, their breathing forming collective clouds of white steam in the freezing air. No one spoke. The traditional longhouses stood empty as the community maintained a solemn vigil, their hearts united in a shared hope that the long weeks of hardship were about to reach their definitive fulfillment. In this moment of profound stillness, as an entire community holds its breath under the winter stars, we invite you to rest your mind and join our peaceful circle. If you find solace in these quiet tapestries of human resilience and wish to support the creation of more deeply atmospheric historical journeys, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this video. Your gentle presence helps our small channel grow, ensuring these timeless stories of endurance continue to shine through the darkness. Every eye remained fixed on the mouth of the shaft, waiting for the earth to reveal its long-hidden secret. Down at the absolute baseline of the deep stone pit, the primary digger raised his mallet for what would be the defining strike of the winter migration. With an absolute concentration of strength and technique, the iron tool descended onto the center of the vibrating limestone floor. The impact produced a sharp, echoing crack that resonated powerfully within the narrow cylinder. Instantly, a fine hairline fracture materialized beneath the tool's edge, spiderwebbing outward across the pristine white surface with an incredible rapid momentum. The solid stone matrix split cleanly along its ancient horizontal bedding planes, opening a permanent breach in the mountain's core and breaking the final structural barrier that had separated the village from the living currents below. Immediately following the sudden fracture, the absolute silence of the subterranean chamber was replaced by a low, gurgling murmur that echoed from deep beneath the fractured floor. It was a sound that none of the villagers had heard for months, the unmistakable, fluid music of moving water traveling through the hidden conduits of the limestone. The sound grew steadily in volume, changing from a faint whisper into a robust, rushing cadence that vibrated through the solid walls of the shaft. The earth had ceased to be a silent, frozen fortress. It had become a living fountain, releasing its long-trapped treasure from the darkness and answering the collective determination of the human community with the powerful voice of nature's abundance. Through the intricate network of the spiderwebbed cracks, pure crystal clear water broke through the final stone barrier with a quiet, irresistible force. The moisture did not burst forth in a violent torrent, but bubbled up softly and steadily, forming a shimmering pool that rapidly expanded across the moon-white limestone floor. The water rose around the heavy leather boots of the master diggers, washing away the fine alabaster dust and reflecting the amber radiance of the pine torches in a brilliant display of golden light. It was completely pristine, carrying the authentic, cold crispness of deep mineral shelves, a living wellspring won from the very heart of the plateau during the darkest depths of the winter freeze. As the pristine water began to steadily and rapidly fill the newly carved shaft, the subterranean workers signaled the surface watch with a precise, triumphant sequence of tugs on the rawhide lines. The hoist operators acted instantly, spinning the heavy timber winch to lift the master diggers clear of the rising tide. Suspended within the elmwood buckets, the men ascended through the gradients of white, blue, and grey stone, leaving the murmuring pool behind as it climbed securely up the hand-cut cylinder. When their heads finally cleared the stone-lipped perimeter of the wellhead, they were met not with loud shouts, but with tears of quiet joy and the open, welcoming arms of their kinsmen, returning to the surface world as victors over the drought. The village gathered around the completed masonry wellhead in peaceful, reverent awe as the first full buckets of living water were drawn up into the open air of the common. The water was poured systematically into the large, dry stone cisterns and pine troughs that had been prepared near the site, producing a magnificent, resonant splashing sound that seemed to break the final remnants of the winter's anxiety. By the pale light of the morning sun, the liquid appeared completely transparent, free of mud or debris, carrying only the clean, mineral sweetness of the deep earth. Each vessel filled to the brim stood as a physical validation of their collective labor, a shimmering monument of pure life restored to the high settlement. With the filling of the cisterns, an overwhelming sense of relief and vital energy washed over the entire high plateau, awakening the Carolingian settlement from its long seasonal paralysis. The herdsmen led the thirsty livestock from their dark winter pens, watching in quiet satisfaction as the oxen and sheep drank deeply from the overflowing pine troughs. In the communal kitchens of the longhouses, the great bronze cauldrons were filled with fresh water, allowing the natural flavors of their stored root vegetables and smoked meats to bloom in rich, hearty broths. The hearth fires burned with a renewed celebratory brightness, transforming each dwelling into a sanctuary of genuine comfort where families could eat, drink, and rest without fear. As the daily routine of the village stabilized around the new water source, the community recognized that this handmade monument of communal determination would permanently secure their future for generations to come. The well was more than a technical achievement. It was a physical archive of their ancestral values, its hand-fitted limestone flags etched with the memory of their shared sacrifice, their disciplined cooperation, and their unyielding patience against the elements. Long after the historic winter of the 9th century had passed into legend, the children of the settlement would gather around the stone perimeter, drawing life from the deep heart of the mountain and remembering the ancestors who had carved a path to the light. The Great Winter Migration eventually yielded to the slow cosmic momentum of the changing year, leaving the high plateau in a state of profound undisturbed tranquility. The hand-carved well continued to maintain its permanent hydrostatic height, its geothermal waters remaining perfectly still and clear under the shifting seasonal skies, a constant guarantee of survival for the ancestral home. As the midnight hours returned to wrap the settlement in shadow, the timber longhouses slept securely beneath the silver dust of the Milky Way, their roofs white with rime, but their hearts completely warmed by the abundance of peace that had been won from the deep foundations of the earth. The channel History Under Moonlight is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of relaxation and peaceful sleep. All stories presented on this channel are global historical tales, gently curated and narrated based on themes such as the rise and fall of nations, human cultures, and extraordinary journeys through time.